All right, so we're almost at our 1 o'clock start time, so I'll kind of just start now with our welcome. So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the fourth meeting of the Wellington Circle Study Working Group. My name is Michaela Niles and I'm the MassDOT project manager for this effort. And I'm joined today by members of our consultant team. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and thank our working group members here in attendance today, including any elected officials on the call. So before we launch into the presentation, I'd like to open with a few procedures for today's meeting. Next slide. So first, please note that this virtual public meeting is being recorded. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcript. And by continuing attendance with this virtual public meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. All recordings and chat transcripts will be considered a public record. If you're not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera, keep your microphone muted, and refrain from chatting in the chat or Q&A boxes. Working group members will have the opportunity to ask questions and share comments during the discussion portion of the agenda. To participate, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're participating by phone today, you may dial *9. I will then call your name and you can unmute so that you can share your comment or question. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless speaking and ask that all speakers start by stating their name. And this will benefit everyone, especially those who are participating by phone. Working group members will be able to share their video. You may keep your video on or off, but the main request is to minimize distractions for others who are viewing the presentation. And members of the public in attendance may submit comments or questions at any time in writing using the Q&A, and meeting staff will address them as time allows at the end of the presentation. And if you need technical assistance, please email Leah Epstein at lepstein@hntb.com. Next slide, please. So as part of today's agenda, we'll have a brief overview and review of the study process, and then we'll provide an update on the concept development process. And from there, we'll present the short, medium, and long-term alternatives that were refined based on the feedback received at our last working group meeting, and then have a discussion of the alternatives. And finally, we'll outline the next steps for the study process. Next slide, please. And next slide. So as an overview of the background of this study, this is a conceptual planning study to evaluate the existing and future multimodal conditions at Wellington Circle. And this process includes examining ways to redesign the circle to provide better connectivity and improve mobility within the city of Medford and the surrounding region. And based on the analysis and the feedback received over the course of the study, short, medium, and long-term recommendations will be developed, and those will be included in a draft final report that will be released for public comment, then finalized in a final report. Next slide, please. And so this slide details the goals and objectives of the study, which were developed at the onset of the process. And these are carried throughout the study and really help guide the development of the alternatives. And so the primary goals for this effort are to improve safety and mobility for all transportation modes and users in the Wellington Circle area, improve quality of life for residents, and improve local and regional connectivity. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the process itself, this flowchart outlines the study tasks, and each step builds upon the previous one. The step highlighted in orange indicates where we are now. And as I mentioned today, we will be discussing the development of the short, medium, and long-term alternatives. And so with that, I will now hand it over to Gary McNaughton of the consultant team to share updates on the concept development process. Gary?
Thank you, Michaela, and good afternoon. So I'm going to run through quickly the process overall for developing the alternatives and concepts that we've been walking through and where we're at this point. So you recall previously we had shared some preliminary concepts, how we were screening those through fatal flaws, but we were primarily at that point talking about automotive traffic and how are vehicles getting through here as that first level of assessment to start to develop some concepts with the promise and the understanding that we're going to start looking at pedestrians, bicycles, transit. And that's really what we've been doing since we last met, screening those alternatives through those modes, looking at additional fatal flaws to try to filter out and refine those concepts, and then identifying what are the feasible concepts that we can take into that detailed alternatives analysis and comparing those and evaluating them based on the goals that were established. Next slide. So following up from where we last left off, there were a few items that were requests as we left the meeting, looking at similar intersections. How do the volumes at Wellington compare to some of the other notable intersections in this area? Looking at some of the concepts, refreshing and reviewing what we did previously and where we're at now. We were asked about some examples of quadrant roadways, which I'll refresh your understanding of quadrant roadways as well. And then just an overall update on the process before we dive into some of the refined alternatives that we're looking at now. Next slide. So when you look at Wellington Circle, it leads the way in terms of traffic volumes. And we tried to pull a sampling of, other notable intersections in the area, some, infamous locations, the Sweetser, Santilli, Bell circles. We also pulled in McGrath at Washington Street, another project that's going through looking at taking away the grade separation and bringing it down to grade. So you see that in the fourth row, that one has a little bit under 6,000 vehicles per hour, including the volume on the overpass traveling through that area. But when you look at Wellington, that's almost at 9,000 vehicles as an example. When you go down to the bottom of the list at Casey Arbor Way, for those of you that are familiar with the Forest Hills area, the two main intersections, each of those are carrying less than 4,000 vehicles per day. So it really does put in context where Wellington Circle sits in terms of how much traffic is processed through this intersection. And it's really quite an amazing amount when any of the other ones that are even grade separated don't quite approach that volume. So you see the challenge that we have in trying to come up with solutions to improve operations and accommodate additional modes through this area. Next slide. So as you recall, we looked at some basic concepts. We were looking at, typical intersections and how those could work. And, we had concluded, not surprisingly, that a traditional intersection just isn't really going to be the solution here, but there were some benefits of pulling that Middlesex-Fellsway connection out of the primary intersection along Route 16 that we'll be talking about in a moment, some of the short and medium term concepts, and you'll also see that carried forward into the long-term concepts. We also talked about some advanced concepts, some of the continuous flow and the quadrant roadway that I'll touch upon in a moment. And then we also were looking at grade separation, where if you recall, we really had narrowed it down to that east-west connection being the one that showed some potential for a grade separation alternative. Next slide. So when we looked at the continuous flow intersection, if we recall, the concept here is that left turns are crossing the opposing through traffic in advance of the intersection so that they're able to flow at the same time as through movements through the intersection. We had some early promise on this, but as we started to look at it, it really started to fall behind the quadrant roadway example. And then the challenges for pedestrians and bicyclists through the continuous flow intersection started to really become problematic for us. So we ended up dropping this one from consideration. And if you picture some of those pedestrian accommodations, you have vehicles coming at you from unexpected directions as you're crossing the roadway and such. So this one we've screened out, and you really won't see any more continuous flow alternatives as we're advancing the project further. Next slide. But if you do recall, there was the quadrant roadway connection, which really did start to show some promise in this area, not just for that connection from the south and off to the east between Fellsway and Revere Beach Parkway, but you'll see elements of it on the north side connecting up to Fellsway and off to Revere Beach Parkway, where we started to see some benefits from them. And it really is that you're able to redirect those heavy volume connections out of that main intersection and shift them off to a separate intersection so that individually your intersections can be simplified. They don't have to accommodate every movement. We can restrict left turns and such at those intersections to make them work more efficiently. Next slide. So some examples of quadrant roadways, what do these look like in the real world? And these are not directly applicable. It's hard to find an environment that's exactly like Wellington Circle, but we tried to pick a sampling of other locations around the country. And you can see that these offer different opportunities for land uses within the middle. So, we're not anticipating putting buildings in there, but you have access to those areas between the quadrant roadway. You can still provide connections onto the outside. You end up with signals kind of at each end of the quadrant roadway, as well as at the primary intersection, which is what you'll see on the alternatives as we've advanced them. Next slide. And this is another example, again, just showing a little bit less intense use in the middle. This is mostly construction laydown areas. The project is still being built. But again, another example showing how that quadrant roadway looks, how you can still use it to maintain connections to those abutting properties. Next slide. And then this last one is intended to illustrate some of the landscaping possibilities. They don't have to look like big highways and urban roadways, and we can introduce some landscaping elements. And we'll certainly have some space here where we can do some of that and break up the pavement so that it doesn't look quite so, highway-like as we start to get further into the alternatives development. Next slide. So where we're at is we're really looking at two core long-term concepts. One of them is a grade separated one, which we'll talk about towards the end. The other ones are variations of that quadrant roadway concept. And we have two different flavors of that we'll be talking through. And each one has slightly different benefits, advantages, and disadvantages with them that we'll be evaluating as we advance the project forward. We've also been developing short and medium term concepts, so things that can be implemented that aren't full build, don't require the entire intersection, but we think can offer some benefits to improve mobility through the area without having long-term design efforts and construction impacts. And we've also been spending a lot of time working at other modes, trying to how every one of these alternatives, how are peds and bikes going to travel through them. We've been considering transit, but we'll talk a little bit about why we don't have transit quite as fully developed with some of the moving parts out there with bus network redesign and Silver Line and other things that may change some of the routing that we're looking at. But we're certainly considering transit as we advance through the project and the alternatives development. The one thing that we have taken off, and you may recall we talked about this before, was possibly converting Middlesex Ave to one-way northbound, away from the intersection to remove that movement, simplify operations. When we started really playing around with that and incorporating that into concepts, we saw that it didn't really give us the benefits that outweighed the impacts of changes in travel patterns that resulted in vehicles diverting over to already congested areas and really created more problems than it solved. So we have taken that one out of our alternatives at this point. Next slide. So now to talk a little bit about the alternatives development that we've been doing. As I said, we've been really looking at the other modes. We talked a lot in the early part of this project in establishing goals about bicycle and pedestrian connections being important. And when you look at the potential for walking through this area and biking through this area, it gets rated very high within any of the planning documents. So it's something that we really do want to incorporate. And we've been looking at how pedestrians and bikes are going to be integrated into these alternatives. Next slide. When you look at the bicycle network in the area, you do see that void. You've seen this before. There's that big gap between some of the existing and planned bicycle facilities, and Wellington Circle becomes that area that's a barrier to try to connect between these different facilities that are out there. And we're really working on trying to make sure that that barrier is removed and that bicyclists can get through this area, make those connections to those other facilities being constructed. Next slide. And then, we do have all of the data behind it, not just the vehicle volumes that we've been talking about previously, but all of the pedestrian volumes. This information has helped to inform us on desire lines, where the pedestrians need to connect to. We also have the bicycle volumes. Not surprisingly, they're very low in this area, but we also know that there's a high potential for bikeability. And if we build it, they will come. So we're not just tying our hands with the bicycle volumes that are out there. We're really looking at building facilities that will encourage more folks and accommodate the folks that would be here if they could be here comfortably. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Deanna to talk briefly about some of the short and medium term alternatives. Deanna.
Thanks, Gary. So as Gary mentioned, I'll be discussing the short and medium term concepts that we started analyzing. This includes dechannelizing right turn movements, removing the eastbound left turn movement through the circle, relocating Middlesex Ave, and then a combination of the above concepts. Next slide. So in some circumstances, dechannelizing right turns can improve connectivity, reduce pedestrian crossing lengths, and increase pedestrian comfort. But they can also create high vehicle delays, long queues, and challenges with signal phasing and timing. So we've started to look at each quadrant separately and determining the pros and cons of dechannelizing each of the right turn movements. Currently, the northbound right and the westbound right and the northeast quadrant are signalized and have high right turning volumes, particularly the northbound right, that's where the pointer is, has very high volume. As you can see, we haven't shown this dechannelization being taken away because it's really clear in the analysis that it needs to stay. It is possible for the westbound right to be dechannelized depending on other improvements that are proposed. The southbound right and the eastbound right are currently unsignalized and could possibly be dechannelized and brought under signal control. The southbound right is low volume and the impacts are less. The eastbound right on the southwest quadrant in front of the state police is a high speed, high volume movement with a large radius. There are potential benefits to bringing this right turn into the intersection and signalizing it, including increasing green space. You can see that large green area in front of the state police. The potential increase in comfort for pedestrians, but again, there are trade-offs where vehicle delays will increase and conflicting pedestrian phases will have to be projected, creating additional signal timing challenges. So as we move forward with the alternatives, we're going to keep looking at whether it makes sense to dechannelize these right turns and how we can balance vehicle delays and queues and signal phasing with the flexibility of when pedestrians can cross. Next slide. Another concept we've been analyzing is prohibiting the eastbound left turns from Revere Beach Parkway to Fells Way northbound. This is not a major movement through the circle and would reduce delay for the westbound movements, which are very heavy, particularly the right turn, westbound right turns, by removing a conflict from the intersection. Since it improves the westbound movements, it also mitigates the impacts of removing the westbound right turn channelization on the northeast quadrant. As you can see, this would enhance eastbound bicycle accommodations and shorten the pedestrian crossing distance across Revere Beach Parkway. This concept would also require the removal of the eastbound right turn channelization so that vehicles that would have taken a left will then be able to instead take a right before getting over to the left lane and making the U-turn to head northbound. So that would be a requirement for this alternative. Next slide. Another concept we've been analyzing is relocating Middlesex Ave so that it intersects with the Fells Way north of Wellington Circle. This reduces vehicle delays for critical westbound left turn movements as well as southbound movements on the Fells Way by removing a fifth leg to the intersection and taking out a phase from the intersection, allowing for reallocating time at the signal. As you can see, this provides a large opening of green space, as well as simplified, reduced, and shortened pedestrian crossings. This also minimizes the impact of removing eastbound right turn channelization. Next slide. This alternative combines the last two to eliminate both eastbound left turns as well as relocate Middlesex Ave. The results of this alternative combine the improvements from the above, or the last two alternatives, with overall operational benefits for both pedestrians and vehicles. And it also mitigates the impacts of removing the right turn channelization in both the eastbound and westbound directions. Next slide. And so in conclusion, we are continuing to investigate these short-term and medium-term concepts to determine what makes the most sense to come out of this study for recommendations. I'll now turn it over to Connor to discuss the longer-term alternatives.
Thank you. So as Gary was discussing up to this point, we've primarily been looking at the vehicular concerns in and around Wellington Circle. But that being said, we've put a more of a longer term focus on improving the multimodal transportation throughout Wellington Circle. So I'm going to go into some of the potential considerations that will be included in not just the concept, but the overall final design of Wellington Circle and the at-grade alternatives that we've developed or that will be developed. Next slide, Natalie. So while pedestrian facilities do currently exist throughout Wellington Circle, there is an opportunity to improve these facilities given the amount of space that will be created with the changing roadway alignments, whether that's shorter crossings, more direct pedestrian routes. Those are both a goal that we have that can be achieved throughout Wellington Circle. If you go to the next slide. And then with the revised alignment, there's also a much larger opportunity to create more green space and more comfortable pedestrian facilities within with the new amenities, whether it be lighting and street furniture, again, improved green space, more buffer between vehicles and pedestrians, so on and so forth. Next slide. From a bike standpoint, there are currently no bike facilities that exist traveling through Wellington Circle, as Gary pointed out earlier, but there are certainly connections to be made adjacent to Wellington Circle, which is providing an opportunity to create more comfortable bike facilities throughout the area. So this includes potential sidewalk separated bike lanes and on-street separated facilities to connect to the existing facilities that are adjacent to Wellington Circle. And then if you go to the next slide, Natalie, when we're designing for bikes in this complicated network, this is going to require signalization and intersection design to help the bikes traverse the various crossings that will be designed throughout Wellington Circle. So this means potential bike signals to help facilitate these crossings or creating protected crossings wherever possible to provide the most comfortable network for the intersections for bicycles. Next slide. From a transit perspective, I know Gary kind of alluded to this earlier, but there's a lot of moving parts in the plan for transit through Wellington Circle with the Silver Line and MBTA service planning studies reviewing this area for potential use going forward. As of now, we haven't necessarily included any specific transit components in the alternatives analysis, but there are plenty of options to review for future consideration, ranging from whether it be exclusive bus lanes that we're seeing around our area a lot right now. If you go to the next slide, Natalie, all the way to just simply incorporating just bus stops throughout Wellington Circle, whatever the design ends up being. No matter what the eventual answer is for transit in this area, transit will be designed with the other modes in mind as well as itself. So including floating bus stops, as you can see in the slides, making sure peds, bikes, and transit vehicles are incorporated well, have their own dedicated space, and can move efficiently through the area. So given all that, excuse me, given all that, we're going to move into our two at-grade concepts that we've developed so far, and we're going to start with one that we're calling the triangle. So this is a bit more of a dual quadrant roadway system. And we're seeing pedestrian crossings at all legs of the intersection, except at the Revere Beach Parkway and Fellsway intersection that Natalie's highlighting right there. We are not showing a crossing on the eastern side of that intersection based on the number of travel lanes and the signalization and whatnot. It's going to be pretty tough to include that in there. So that is really the only crossing we're not showing throughout this area. Overall, there's a lot more room for pedestrians and bikes, as you can see with the light gray and the light brown shown throughout the area on the sides of the roads to provide a lot of connections in and around Mystic Valley, Revere Beach, Fellsway, Middlesex, going through the entire Wellington Circle area. And then on the inner triangles, you'll see that those brown areas are getting wider. So we're going to be looking at including bi-directional facilities there for bikes and pedestrians. So that way, no matter where you're coming from, you have an easy connection, whether you're heading north, south, east, or west. You'll also notice that we're not showing driveways on this plan. We're not currently at that level of detail. And this also includes the state barracks that Deanna was getting into a few minutes ago. We still have some coordination to do with them in knowing that we still need to have access into that facility. What it's going to look like is to be determined later as we move through the alternatives analysis and then eventually the design process. From a vehicular standpoint, most of the paths where vehicles will travel are pretty self-explanatory, or we can go into some specifics later. But I wanted to point out a couple movements. So if you hit the next button, Natalie, we have Revere Beach Parkway to Fellsway southbound. So this is going to utilize one of the quadrant roadways with a couple of double left-hand turns. Currently, this movement operates with two intersections, and this will stay the same in this proposal or in this alternative, but ideally with more efficient intersections than what's currently operating out there today. Go to the next movement. Conversely, heading from Fellsway up to Revere Beach Parkway, we're looking at two double or double right turn lanes to make the right onto Revere Beach Parkway. This adds an extra intersection, but with the right turn movements, we're looking at this movement operating pretty smoothly. And then the last movement to discuss is the Fellsway southbound to continue on Fellsway or to head west on Mystic Valley Parkway. Currently, this intersection needs has two intersections to make this movement itself, and we're keeping this in this alternative. The difference is that there is truly a right turn movement from Fellsway to continue on to Fellsway and Mystic Valley Parkway, which makes this through movement a bit more of a double right turn. But through signalization and some other design, we can make this as efficient as possible to make it seamless to continue on the Fellsway and towards Mystic Valley as well. If you go to the next slide, Natalie, there's a bit more of a conclusion here. Excuse me. Overall, we're looking at the intersections or this area being able to handle the same existing volumes that we're looking at now. A lot more open space for multimodal use and future bike connections. The main drawback is the atypical intersection north of Mystic Valley and Revere Beach Parkway. But again, we can do some work with that to make it work as best as possible. Moving forward from there, we're getting into our second at-grade concept, which you'll notice the main difference north of Mystic Valley and Revere Beach is more of a square than a triangle. So this is where the square concept comes in from. Overall, it's a pretty similar concept, still dual quadrant roadway system. The main differences you'll see with the square, we still have bike and pedestrian connections through the middle of the square, and those will allow connections north, south, east, and west, depending which way you're going. It's also more of a traditional intersection layout, which will be more familiar to drivers moving through the intersection. But from a vehicular standpoint, you'll see a couple of changes from the triangle alternative. So if you hit the next button, you'll see first, if going from Fellsway southbound to Revere Beach Parkway, it's a bit of a left-right-left scenario to turn left onto 9th Street, right onto Middlesex, and then left again into Revere Beach Parkway. This is the same amount of existing intersections it is to make this move today. The difference between the triangle and the square concept, the Middlesex Ave intersection is signalized in the square. It was unsignalized in the triangle concept. So that is the big difference between these on this in this case. But again, with signalization, we can make this movement pretty efficient. Same thing with the next movement here, moving from Middlesex down to Mystic Valley and the Fellsway. We're looking at 3 intersections to get through this entire movement, which is actually 1 less intersection than exists out there currently. So that will hopefully help make this a bit more efficient. And then the last movement that we wanted to point out is the Revere Beach Parkway to Fellsway northbound. Technically, you would be able to make this movement by turning right onto Middlesex and left onto 9th Street. But based on where we're looking to send the most volume and being able to handle the most volume, we'd be guiding vehicles from Revere Beach to the Fellsway to turn right and continue north, knowing that those intersections will be able to handle more of the volume that we'd be sending through here. And if you go to the next slide for the kind of conclusions for the square, again, similar benefits. The main change is that with the different geometry and intersection design, we would need a bit more of vehicle space or vehicle lanes to make this operate correctly, and then also add in the additional signalized intersection at Middlesex Ave. And if you move to the next slide, Natalie, we'll see overall that the concepts are pretty similar, as I said. We really just see that certain connections work better in one rather than the other. And we'll be exploring these more when we get to the alternatives analysis and kind of start diving into them a bit more through there. So before I pass off to Nate to talk about the grade separated concept that we have, there's still, even with the grade separation, there still is an at-grade network of roadways that are still incorporated. So I wanted to talk through those a tiny bit before allowing Nate to talk through the grade separation piece specifically. Overall, there are still a lot of intersections given the various traffic patterns that we obviously have going through this area. The positive with this is that those intersections become a lot simpler based on the removal of the eastbound and westbound movements being overhead. So a few different ones specifically. We obviously have the heading northbound and southbound coming from Revere Beach Parkway. You can split that at a kind of a split intersection underneath the grade separation to head towards the intersections on either side of the of the grade separation to continue on up and or north or south of Fellsway. The next movement we'll see is similar to the at-grade concepts we just talked about, going right from Fellsway northbound to the Revere Beach Parkway eastbound movement. Similar double right-hand movement there. Again, just the intersection become a bit simpler with the removal of the eastbound and westbound movements. And then heading southbound from Fellsway to Revere Beach Parkway, you'll see that it's, again, there's simpler intersections with only a couple of conflicts with the proposed roadways in there. Otherwise, the other things to note is that Middlesex Ave in this case would be routed east down 9th Street. It would not connect into Wellington Circle here. And lastly, the northbound and southbound movements on the Fellsway, you'll see that there are more intersections in that along this or in this alternative, but with coordination and signalization, that can become a pretty seamless process to make sure that it operates more as one intersection rather than four. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Nate to tell you a bit more about the grade separation piece.
Thanks, Connor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the structures associated with the grade separated options. So the first one we looked at was an above grade option carrying Route 16 east and west. And what we ended up laying out was a 640-foot long 4-span continuous bridge. The bridge geometry is based off of the MassDOT Bridge Manual guidance and maintains a 16.5-foot vertical clearance above the intersection. The bridge depth itself would be approximately 8 feet with a 2'8" barrier that sits atop of it. So your total structure depth there, you're looking about 11 feet. The width of the bridge is 40 feet, and this is carrying 1 lane of travel in each direction with 5-foot shoulders and a 6-foot painted median. The approach walls leading up to the bridge are approximately 19 feet at the abutment, with the barrier above that as well. And they come down at a 4% grade. So tying back into the existing roadways, that gives you an approach wall of about 500 feet on either end of the bridge. Thus, the total length of the bridge structure is about 1,600 feet. So it's a pretty significant structure. What you're looking at here is an isometric view of the overpass, kind of looking northeast direction. You can see here, again, that abutment height there at the west abutment. And I think one thing to note is we did start with a 2-span option originally. And when you bring that in, your elevation goes up on those walls, and those walls were at 25 feet plus that barrier on top. So it was a pretty significant wall. So what we wanted to do was pull that back, kind of open up that intersection a little bit. Next slide. So again, here's just another view of the overpass. It's a little bit more close up. You're looking southwest direction, and I kind of can see under the bridge a little bit, so it kind of gives a little better angle from ground level there, depicting that what that might look like. Next slide. So the other concept we looked at also was an underpass, and we quickly realized that there were several issues that would make it, I guess, more costly and potentially disruptive to traffic. The first being that there could be severe traffic impacts if the underpass was closed due to a flood event or a rainstorm. We looked around. The Mystic River Watershed Association has a bunch of maps that cover potential flooding due to rainfall and climate change. And the maps show that by the year 2070, the Wellington Circle area will likely be a significant risk for flooding during a relatively common rainstorm. So therefore, any type of underpass option is going to require a pump station and the supporting drainage and utilities associated with that. The next potential issue that came up was increased probability of encountering utility conflict during construction. When you're building a 12 or 1,600 foot long tunnel and boat sections, you're going to come across utilities. I think one worth noting is I think the MWRA has a 48-inch water main that serves as an emergency backup water supply that runs down the Fellsway to Middlesex Ave. So this would most likely need to be relocated at a significant cost to the project, along with any other utilities that would become in conflict with. The next item is cost. So underpasses are typically 50% more expensive than a bridge of equal length. And this is kind of based off of most recent projects with MassDOT Bridge and then also Massport with their tunnel projects. This compares a high level and it's based on the structure, and it does not include the cost of relocating large utilities such as a water main or the inclusion of a pump station for infrastructure with that. So you can kind of assume that the cost associated with it be higher than that 50% based off of knowing this information already. The next bullet is in regards to construction staging. So with an underpass option, there's an increase in support of excavation and a footprint. That footprint is larger to build, just making it more difficult to stage construction and keep traffic moving through that while they're building it. And then lastly, just depending on the length of the underpass, it can depend, you might need life safety or fire suppression that is included in that tunnel system. So there's quite a few concerns associated with the underpass option relative to an overpass option. Next slide. So these are our conclusions based off the grade separated. Obviously, the benefits are it removes major movements from the surface roadways and it limits the number of lanes required to handle existing volumes. However, the drawbacks are that the surface roadways still require a high number of lanes. The bridge is pretty long and it uses significant space at grade. And lastly, the bridge is really acting as a visual barrier bisecting the transit station from the nearby residents and businesses in that area. So from here, I'm going to pass it back to Gary to go over the alternative refinement.
Thanks, Nate. And we do see the questions and hands raised, and we'll be opening up for discussion in a moment. I did just want to kind of wrap things up of what's going on next and kind of how we got to where we are. I know one of the questions was talking about traffic volumes and what we've used. Everything that's been developed was based off of existing traffic volumes, pre-pandemic volumes is what we've been working on. One of our big next steps is to figure out those future volumes, to look at what long-term impacts will happen from changes in travel patterns relating from the pandemic and as well as mode shift and growth and other things in the area. And we're not working alone on that effort. Both the Silver Line project as well as McGrath Boulevard project are all working that same effort of trying to identify what that future volume scenario looks like and what's the right thing to really plan for and design for. So we will be taking all of that into consideration as we advance these concepts, looking at updated traffic volume scenarios, future volume scenarios, advancing those short and medium term concepts, and looking at how do the analyses work with those different volume sets for those conditions, as well as for the longer term concepts. What happens with some of the transit integration that we've talked about? Can we help facilitate mode shift? Can we better accommodate existing transit service, planned transit service, some of the things that are on the drawing board for updating and modifying bus routes and bus service such as Silver Line through the area, and really expanding out, looking at the connections to existing facilities. There's a lot of lanes on these concepts. I know that's a comment that's certain to come back, and I think I've already seen that in some of the questions. We've designed what can accommodate reasonably well what we're seeing today. The next steps are to see, okay, what can we look at in the future? What can we tolerate for mode shift? What do we need to accommodate? And where can we go from here? We're in kind of a different world than what you're typically doing on a planning project like this. If we were doing this 10 years ago, we'd be projecting out what is the traffic volume going to grow to in the year 2030, and you'd be planning for that higher volume. Now we're talking more about mode shift and changes in travel patterns that are a different way of looking at these things, and we'll be certainly doing that in the next round as we start to look at the alternatives evaluation. These are just the frameworks of those alternatives that we're going to advance into that process. We're also going to progress the grade separated concept. We talked a lot about the underpass. I know Nate hit on some of the challenges with that. We didn't show it. You can envision that it's going to be a similar length to what the grade the above grade structure would look like. So it's going to have a similar footprint. and just have more significant costs and impacts. But we are going to be carrying a grade separated concept into the alternatives evaluation. I think it's important for, even if there's not a lot of support for it for completeness, so that somebody looking at this study down the road understands. We looked at a grade separated concepts. We identified the cost implications. We looked at what benefits might come from that. We'll be refining those surface road networks and developing modeling and such to help evaluate that concept as well as the grade separated, as well as the at-grade concept. So with that, I will turn it back to Michaela.
Thanks, Gary. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to members of the working group. And so to share any comments or questions, and I see a few virtual hands raised already. So we will start with Bill. Bill, you will be able to unmute.
Hi, this is Bill Carlson. I'm on the board of Parkway Plaza South condominiums. And I raised my hand when I was looking at the traffic flows you were studying. I want to remind you that there are roughly 3,000 residents in the little area between 9th Street and Revere Beach Parkway, like 10 buildings. There's a similar, a more dense area right across the street at Station Landing. And so we've got our own little small town here. And all of your analysis seemed to be aimed at going past us as opposed to us getting to and from our residences. I cringed when somebody mentioned using 9th Street East as a travel path. I thought that our community had made it very clear that we want to leave 9th Street only for local residents, and that all passage on 9th Street should assume that there's going to be kids on tricycles zigzagging back and forth on it. And it's up to the town to protect those kids. We're not a passageway through. We're a place where people live. The other thing is that I think that you can expect very strong opposition to a raised roadway in our front yard. You just take it for granted. We're going to mobilize every resident here and all of our friends. It's not going to happen.
Yep. No, and we hear you on the at-grade. Like I said, we have to really include that. It's just for completeness on the study. I think it would be, notable if it wasn't in there, if somebody's looking at the study. So, don't take that as something that we're advocating for by any means. We're agnostic on all of these. With regards to the access to the resident properties.
Excuse me.
With regards to access to the residents, we haven't shown the driveways. The intent of all of these is to simplify and facilitate access for all modes through these areas. So, we do think that any of these concepts, we have made sure that they do not preclude access. They do not complicate access. The 9th Street cut through that happens a lot today. We're hopeful that we can facilitate some of those movements to make that less desirable. And that's really the next level of detail when we start to look at ways to discourage patterns that we don't like on a road like 9th, to make sure that you aren't seeing that cut through that happens today in the future, whether it's in the short term or the long term. So those are certainly things we'll be incorporating.
Could I just follow up on those questions?
Sure.
First point, when I talk about access to my building, I don't mean my driveway. I mean that the people that live in my building, what are the major places we come from? We come from 93, coming east on Route 16. We come from Everett and Chelsea, coming west on 16. We come from Assembly and Boston north. We come from up north and coming down. Actually, I would encourage you, strongly request that you think about yourself as living here and figure out how you would get in and out of here from all the major places that people who live here might be coming from and to. I'm not talking just about getting into the driveway. Second point is, okay, you say you've got an obligation to do a separated study. If you're going to do it, then do the underground, because you might get some support for a passage under with park over it or something. you're going to get fierce resistance to an elevated roadway. So the fact that it costs, 50% more to go underground, at least you've got a shot. So if you're going to do a study, do something you might actually be able to build. Because I guarantee you, we will stop you from building an elevated roadway.
Nope, thanks for that input.
Thank you. We next have a raised hand from Amanda.
Thank you. It's a question on the same page. There's a lot of green, which is great, but I just want to make sure, when we're thinking about pedestrians with their differing abilities, they may not be able to go all the way around to get to the other side. And I know I brought this up last meeting, and I like the concept of the square quadrant with the paths going through. I just want to make sure that when we think about signals, the length of signals, cross signals, that we think about that. But for some folks, it may take them longer to cross those intersections. And then also, any areas of large green space, we do really focus on pass through those green spaces.
Thank you. Yes, and we've shown some paths, more on the squares, just because they lend themselves to it. But certainly, there's a lot of programming to happen with any of those open spaces in terms of what paths go in there, what else goes in there. So those are certainly things to be considered, to some degree within this effort. But as the project moves forward beyond this, those become important elements of that design.
Thank you for the comments and questions. Next, we have a raised hand from Doug.
We're not hearing you, Doug.
Hear you.
No.
So while we work out the technical issue, next we have a raised hand from Jeff Bucksbaum.
Hi, Jeff Bucksbaum from Walk Medford. First of all, good job, you guys. It's a tough project. That volume chart you had at the beginning was a real eye opener, showing just how much traffic's going through here versus other places that are grade separated. So that's, really speaks to the challenge that you have. I have two thoughts. One is I agree with the previous commenter that showing the sort of the mock-up of the bridge, I would say drop that now. There's no way anyone's going to accept that, save the money and put it somewhere else, because there's no way. We're taking down bridges. We're not putting them up in situations like this. So if there is a grade separation, I'd say, the underground is the way to go and save the money on the bridge. And just the last thought is, and I appreciate you guys, I spend most of my advocacy life thinking about pedestrians. It looks like you're paying attention to that. Any of these, it's going to be a long walk for someone to get across the intersection, but I appreciate that you guys are prioritizing that. I do think transit needs to get incorporated. I know you say you're waiting for other efforts to go on, but when I think about where we, when I can't go a day without hearing about climate change, and I gotta believe that at MassDOT, there's some sort of directive. I don't know what the MassDOT policies are that says, we're thinking, anything we're doing has to prioritize, getting people either out of cars or out of, gas fueled cars, that getting people to the station has to be a priority in some way. So if we're looking at this from either a short-term or a long-term perspective, feels like the transit has to be front and center. And I just it would encourage, if we can even anticipate where some of these other efforts are going to go or leave it so that they can incorporate the places that they may go. I think that's important. So, take the money you save by dropping the bridge option and put it into the transit. I think that would be money well spent. Thank you guys for doing a good job.
Thank you. And the timing of the other transit efforts, both Silver Line and the bus network redesign are going to allow us to incorporate those as we advance. Those projects are moving along in the coming months, and we'll have some more clear direction that we can build upon.
Yeah, but even a transit lane, I don't know, it just feels like, we're going to do major work to this intersection, not incorporating transit priority, you're going to have to. I mean, you're doing it other places, and it just feels like, how. And I saw some of the comments in the Q&A. We should be talking about getting the volume down. So that's an interesting question, and it's tough. Philosophically, on an individual project, to say we're going to take the lead is tough. So I guess the message to MassDOT to take back to your bosses is it really should be coming from the top that says this shall be the case if we are serious about the climate change stuff that we're talking about. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. Doug, I see your raised hand.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for that. I think there's some great ideas here in the short and medium term concepts. There's a lot better pedestrian, bike access, more green space. There's some great ideas there. So I think that's all pretty good. I think I'm disappointed that there's not a little bit more there for transit. You did address that, but it seems like that would be the next step to try to push that a little bit further. But my big comment is about the at-grade, the two diagrams on the right on screen, the dual quadrant triangle and the square. They just seem so complicated right now. I was hoping for something that would be simpler, and they just, both for the pedestrian and the vehicle operator, those are like diagrams that I've never seen before. And I understand that why they came about. The logic is solid to me. But at the end of the day, we have two major roads, one running north-south, one running east-west. And this just looks like a lot of spaghetti on the plan. And it just, is there no way that a literally north-south, east-west intersection could work? It was kind of dismissed at the beginning, but it seems like when I see that diagram as somebody who's driving, it would just seem, it makes the existing intersection almost feel comparable in terms of its complexity. And I think simplicity is always the best for any movement of any vehicle or any person. And I just don't see any simplicity here. I see so much. I thought the Mystic Ave thing was going to kind of be taken off the table and maybe dovetailed into a fire lane, but it just seems like the geometry here is mightily complicated. And I guess I don't see that as a great improvement for any mode of transportation, if at least compared to what we have now. But I'm certainly not a traffic engineer, and I will certainly defer to the group on that.
Yeah, no, and we did in an earlier meeting, we started with a simple intersection. What could it look like if we just connect these roadways? And if we just connect them without Middlesex being part of the main intersection. And the challenge that you end up with is the number of different movements that you have to accommodate in that one intersection result in a far less efficient operation, because your signal now has to have 6 phases or 7 phases instead of what you're seeing here, which may be 2 or 3. And that's where we're able to get the greater efficiency in operations with these configurations. And that's what led us to them. But your point's well taken that there's still a good number of lanes. It's not a typical design. I think the patterns look a little more complicated than they would feel on the ground for a lot of these movements. But it's a challenging intersection. You've got a high number of vehicles, and even if we look at reductions, you saw we were probably 20% higher than any other intersection that we looked at. We may be able to refine this, and if we look at different future scenarios, remove some lanes. But I think the idea of trying to get to a simple 4-way intersection just isn't something that can accommodate the traffic. And what you might see is, maybe those short and medium term concepts get us 80 or 90% of the way of the long term. And, we rethink where the project goes overall. But those are the next steps to really start to assess these. This is kind of what we came up with that can work. So now how does this meet the goals of the project?
Appreciate that, Gary. And I think the green space in both these are both much superior in terms of pedestrian safety and reduced crossing length. There's a lot here that are going to make people feel like they can get across that intersection without taking their lives into their hands, which I think a lot of people do now. So I appreciate that. Is there a sense that with changes in modes, with pedestrian, all the things we're talking about, that the numbers of vehicles will actually go down over time and maybe not be the number one in the 10-mile radius, but they would actually be reduced because of the increased transit, because of the more bikes, better walking conditions. Is there any chance that would happen?
Yeah, and I think if you look at, as I said, we're basing all of this on 2019 volumes. So pre-pandemic patterns have certainly changed. We're certainly seeing morning volumes still aren't back to where they were. They may never get back to where they were, fully. So we're seeing those changes in patterns. You may see changes in modes as if the Silver Line project comes through here, this is one of the potential routes that's being considered. Does that change it? Does just some of the bus network improvements shift those modes? Can we integrate transit into this network to facilitate some of that mode shift? And certainly if you're local and you're in this neighborhood, this is going to be a much easier place to walk and bike through that will certainly shift some modes for those shorter trips. You probably have people driving short distances just to not have to walk or bike through this intersection. And some of that would certainly happen. So identifying those future volumes, like I said, what used to be a pretty standard methodology now gets far more complex and could result in changes and decreases in traffic volumes.
One final comment. I agree that with the previous comments that the elevated one is a non-starter and the depressed one, even though you need to study them, they just feel like they're going backwards and they're probably just not viable for 100 reasons. But thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Amanda, I see your raised hand.
I have a couple more questions. Do you want all of them or one by one?
Oh, go ahead.
I guess I'll just do all of them. Okay, so question about kind of coinciding with the previous comment. As we make more lanes and more, less of a simple intersection, I know that we've never, there's no other urban areas that are similar to this, as you explained at the beginning. But do we foresee the potential for increased wrecks? With people not understanding, oh, I have to turn this way now, I have to turn this way. And I think just any intersections, even somewhat similar to this, again, maybe not as complicated, but similar in other cities, other urban areas, was there an increase in vehicle wrecks or anything, accidents? So that's the first question. Do you want to answer that? Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I can't imagine something more confusing than the existing conditions. So I think it will be clearer to drivers. The expectation would be that we would be reducing the number of crashes. We certainly would be hard pressed to find an example that looks just like this in its entirety, but we may be able to look at in isolation the individual intersections of areas that look, like if you look at the east side of the intersection where it's that left turn connection and the northbound right turn only, we may be able to find similar connections to that and look at crash experiences in those locations.
So I don't know about the other members of the working group, but I would appreciate that.
Okay.
Second question is the businesses in the area. I'm sure you've had conversations with businesses, but potentially, folks are using the intersection less, or it's more complicated, so they're not going that way. While the reduction in traffic could be good, it could also add more to, create more issues for the businesses, less business getting to them. And so I was curious, any conversations with the businesses?
I mean, to the extent that they're representing on the working group, but we'll certainly be having more direct conversations, as Connor indicated. We haven't gotten to that driveway connectivity point. That's the next step in it. Honestly, when you increase pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, that's a benefit to the businesses. So hopefully that would help them, even if there's a reduction in vehicle volumes. Those improved access for other modes would actually help them in the long run. I know we've had conversations of folks, you don't cross this circle if you want to get a bite to eat on the other side or frequent those businesses, you just choose not to. So hopefully these alternatives could open it up and make that more inviting and actually help those businesses. But that's certainly something we'll be working on as we advance.
Happier customers, I get that. And the last question is, when you talk about alternatives, and I understand as part of the study, you want to look at everything and bring alternatives to the table, even if they're not going to be the best option. And I think the working group and everybody at these meetings and the public hopefully appreciates that. But I do think as we can continue on, some of those, in my opinion, if it's just there's no evidence at all that they should even be considered, why even bring them to the table? I think it just adds complications and confusion to the conversation sometimes. But I also understand you have to study everything. It's just my thought.
Yeah, and concepts get screened out along the way at various points, right? We've had a lot that we screened out previously through fatal flaws. And with these studies, it's just as important to document what you didn't include as well as what you did, because somebody may pick this up 2 or 3 years from now. I've seen studies that get picked up 10 years later, and you're trying to build off of them. And you're like, why didn't they think of, whatever idea you've come up with? So I always find if you've shown we did think of that, here's why we didn't do it. And maybe that's input from the abutters that isn't going to be obvious from an analysis or an engineering perspective, but there was comments and feedback that made a concept not viable. That documentation is a very important part of any of these studies.
Next, see a raised hand from Bill.
I'm curious. I think it was 2 meetings ago, a circle concept was presented with a picture of a very beautiful intersection in Holland. Could you refresh my memory of how thoroughly making this a real circle was evaluated and why that idea was rejected?
We did look at it, fairly thoroughly. The challenge with it, and the reason that I'm saying fairly thoroughly and not in great detail, is that the volumes just overwhelm a circle, and you end up with, I don't even think 3 lanes could actually accommodate the volumes. You started looking at 4-lane circles and things that you would only see in Europe, not in Holland, but in London and places or over in Asia where you see these 6 and 8-lane circles. We just weren't able to come up with anything close. We looked at them even just for segments of it. When you look at the concepts on the right, just could we make that northern intersection itself a circle? And we just weren't able to get anything that had a volume even close to the thresholds for being able to be accommodated through a circle. So we did try, but it wasn't something that we could even get close on to make them viable elements of the project.
Are there any other? Oh, Brad, I see your raised hand.
Hey, Michaela, thanks. And thank you, group. This is a super thoughtful discussion, and I appreciate all the working group members' comments. My name is Brad Ross, and I serve the city of Somerville as Director of Mobility. And I'm here representing our terrific new mayor, Tatiana Ballantyne. Mayor Joe sends his regards, and don't worry, he's going to keep up the fight on climate change and equity in his new role. But we're just really excited to support our partners in the city of Medford, our other neighboring municipalities, and Mass DOT and MBTA on this effort, as well as the folks at the DCR. Gary, obviously we've had a whole series of questions here in the comment and verbally about traffic reductions. And I just want to say something that I've said at previous working group meetings. Please do reach out to me if we can be helpful providing any of our post-project evaluation data for road diet, for transit lane, and for other complete streets work that we have done on both local city-controlled streets, as well as in partnership with our state agency partners like DOT and the DCR. we have found that when we prioritize walking, biking, and mass transit, we often get the great side benefit of reduced daily motor vehicle traffic, and we can help quantify things to help fine tune your modeling efforts. We know that DOT and DCR are exhibiting real leadership in shrinking roadways to support all of our safety, equity, and resilience goals. And we definitely just want to make sure that you have access to the information that we've learned in Somerville. So, kudos to all of the participants in this process, but let's not be constrained by the present we have. Let's plan together for the future that we want and deserve.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions from the working group at this time?
Hi, this is Alicia Hunt from the City of Medford. I just want to jump in real quick because I'm actually going to have to jump off for another call and say thank you very much for all the work you've done so far. I can tell that you guys are really very familiar with this. I haven't heard any comments from the public or anybody that I disagreed with. I support them in general. I was disappointed to see moving forward to an overpass idea, even at any thought, because again, we're very unhappy with overpasses, as everybody else has said. And I would encourage you to talk with some of our climate experts on the issues with an underpass idea, because part of those maps is showing stuff that we are working to look at funding with the federal government on how can we prevent that kind of devastating flooding from occurring, because it would be incredibly devastating to the community if we had regular flooding of the scale that's showing on that. So we are working on strategies with the state and federal government to prevent that from occurring. I realize that's not the only roadblock, and mild flooding would always occur. We have underpasses today that flood, kind of regularly. But I would encourage you to actually speak to some of us who are working in the climate space before ruling it out completely and not just basing it on the maps that are out there, because we have a lot more knowledge about what's going on. But thank you very much. And we appreciate all this work. And it's great. I've been asked recently many, many times about this study, so I appreciate getting the update at this time. So.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nate from our project team.
Yes, no, we can reach out and try to get more insight on the climate strategy moving forward and how that would impact an underpass option for sure. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other comments or questions from the working group at this time? Please feel free to use your virtual raised hand. All right, so seeing none, I'd like to now open it up to members of the public in attendance. So if we want to move to our next slide, if any members of the public here in attendance would like to submit a comment or question in writing, please continue to use the Q&A box. Or if you'd like to share a comment or question verbally, please use the raise hand button. Or if you're joining us by phone today, please dial *9. And this is certainly not the only opportunity to comment or share any questions. You may also do so throughout the study process using the comment form on our study website. And so with that, I will open it up. I see we have a couple of comments and questions in the Q&A box. So I'll start with one from Tom, who asks on the dual quadrant triangle concept for somebody who's biking north on Fellsway, how many times would they have to cross the street and how long would that take in total?
So you may want to go back to that concept graphic for that concept, and we can talk through it. Connor, if you're still on, I'll let you take this one.
Sorry, thank you, Gary. Excuse me. So biking north along Fellsway in the triangle concept, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4 overall intersection crossings based on this roadway layout. So Natalie, she outlined a different way to go, but you could kind of not necessarily the benefit, but what we're showing with the multiple ways to get around, depending on where the signalization or what direction someone was to travel, you could either head east or west up the Fellsway and on the Quadrant Roadway, and then get to Revere Beach Parkway or Mystic Valley Parkway, cross there, and then get to the Fellsway and Quadrant Roadway in the north. And again, depending on where the crossing is active at the moment, it could end up helping to reduce the delay by having one or either of the kind of eastbound or northbound crossings active the moment you get there and heading across at that time. So it's acting as more of a continuation and then only waiting for the next signal to cross Fellsway or cross the Quadrant Roadway to then continue northbound. So with the multiple directions that we're showing within the triangle area, the idea is that you'd be able to get across some of those intersections as soon as possible, rather than having to wait for one specific movement to get across the entire, to cross to the actual northbound piece of the Fellsway. So trying to give the bicyclists and pedestrians more options rather than only one route should hopefully reduce some of that conflict. As in terms of how long would that take in total, we haven't gotten to that piece yet in terms of the signalization and the specific phasing and timing. So we don't have a full-on answer for that right now. But again, the idea would be to allow more options rather than one specific route, northbound, southbound, eastbound, or westbound, to allow for a reduced amount of delay going through the entire area.
Yeah, and I think you'll see the tan representing the bike lanes and the wider sections in the middle where we would allow two-way bike traffic. You'd be able to accommodate that. So again, to Connor's point, increasing the options and the flexibility to travel through this area. And I think at any of the crossings, the idea would be to make them comfortable so that it's an area that, yes, I might have to cross the road, at 3 or 4 different locations, but they're going to be comfortable locations, and we'll work on travel times as we advance the alternatives.
Exactly.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Tom. Our next question in the Q&A comes from Jared, who asks, with the above grade option, what happens to the east-west bike traffic? And does that get moved onto the bridge, which will inevitably involve highway-like speeds, or is that part of the at-grade movement?
The short answer is no, it will stay at grade. You always have the option of, do you include pedestrians and bicycles on the overhead structure? But we were anticipating that they wouldn't be, because you'll have a fully, accessible at grade facility. Exactly how they go, as we said, this one isn't advanced at the surface network to show where all of those connections would be, but you can picture, we'll have them in at all of the crossing locations. So, we'll develop some options for how you can get there. And it may be that you're, crossing the roadway and traveling through some of those green areas, trying to make them as direct as possible, but we'll be adding those as we refine the surface network, and possibly flipping that structure to be underneath all of those surface roadways.
Thank you. We next have a raised hand from Christian. Christian, you should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. So I know you're just beginning to think about future traffic demands and mode shifts, but I'm curious specifically about some of the municipal climate action plans that Somerville and Boston have adopted. I think Medford is also looking at a mode shift target. I know Somerville is looking at trying to reduce car commuting by roughly 1/3 in the next decade or so. Boston wants to cut car commuting in half. And of course, most of the peak hour traffic through here is bound to and from Somerville and Boston. So my question is, does Mass DOT think that those municipal targets are actually credible? And are they gonna, if so, are they gonna use those targets as, what the future condition when you're forecasting future travel demand?
Yeah, I don't know if Michaela, if you want to take it. I know, we're working on the McGrath project with Brad in Somerville for DOT, and that's an area where certainly we are looking at reductions in traffic volumes. I think I pointed out, it's kind of a new way of thinking of projects around, certainly in this area, and from as traditionally, we wouldn't have ever looked at existing volumes to develop these concepts. We would have always said, okay, what's the volume going to be 20 years out, and grow it out, and let's design for that higher volume. We're already starting from a baseline that's level, And then as we start to look at those future volumes, can we start to look at things that push them down? Some of those become, policy decisions. And I know Somerville is firmly behind it in some of their choices that are being implemented on the McGrath project. And how much of that gets translated in similar approaches onto a project like this are things that, we need to really start to nail down as we refine these alternatives and take them into the next steps.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. We next have a question from David, and the team talked a little bit about this earlier, but if you could just kind of reiterate a little bit on this point about kind of the volumes of vehicle traffic and kind of what is being done with both the short, medium, and long-term alternatives to try to reduce those vehicles passing through the intersection and get into a little bit about the mode shifts that we might be seeing.
Yeah, and again, that's a similar type of question, of where can we go from here? Can we start to get more progressive in looking at mode shift and reducing the number of vehicles? As I said, we started out with a flat baseline, and can we start to get more progressive and push those down as we go forward, looking at those future volumes? And that's where we're at now, starting to make those decisions and looking at, can we look at a lower future volume? That's something that's interesting, and I'm enjoying working on projects that are doing that, like McGrath. I will tell you that not everybody thinks that way, so it's not an easy question to answer at times, but it's certainly something that you can see the benefits of. If I can design for fewer vehicles, I can open up things and make things less of a barrier. So hopefully it's things that we can start to look at as we advance the project.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the questions. And just as a quick reminder to anyone, if you'd like to share a comment or question verbally, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us by phone today, you can raise your virtual hand by dialing *9, or if you'd like to share a comment or question in writing, please continue to use the Q&A box. And so our next question in the Q&A comes from Kristen, who asks, will we be able to get a copy of this presentation? Yes, the meeting materials from this meeting and all of our meetings are available on our study website. So this presentation, the recording, will be made available after today. So thank you for the question, Kristen, much appreciated. Next, we have a comment from Tom, and that's a follow-up to his earlier question. And Tom says, to add some clarity, I think the lack of a crosswalk across Revere Beach Parkway is adding significant delay to people biking.
Yeah, we really want to try to figure out a way to put that crosswalk back in. We didn't want to show it now and have to take it away. We felt we're better off with any of these alternatives, kind of not showing a worst, maybe not a worst case, but a worst case scenario than ideal. And if we can add it back in, hey, everybody's happy. If we take things away, then it feels like you've changed and moved those goalposts for people. So we want to put that back in if we can, and figure out, certainly as we look at the overall patterns, it's definitely the most challenging crossing to implement from an overall, mobility and operation standpoint, but we're not done trying.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment, Tom. We have another comment now from Miranda, who says, just want to echo the concerns about pedestrian transit and cycling access. Would love to see these crossings shortened for everyone moving through the area, not in a car. And like Brad said, would love to plan for the future and mode shift we want instead of maintaining the status quo. So thank you, Miranda, for your comments as well. Much appreciated. And so with that, I'm not seeing any new comments or questions in the Q&A or any raised hands at this time, but I'll give it a few moments in case anyone has any additional comments or questions they would like to share. But as I mentioned, this is certainly not the last opportunity to interact with the team or share any comments or questions you have throughout the study. And so seeing no new comments. Oh, we have one question from David Walker, who asks, how much is the working group interacting with the Silverline Extension Group?
So I can answer. I know there's a lot of common members between this working group and the Silverline working group. I'm personally on the Silver Line project, leading a lot of the transportation work on that project as well. So we're intimately involved, and there's a lot of information being shared between those projects, and certainly on the future volume scenarios where I'm personally involved in this project, Silver Line, and McGrath Boulevard. So there's a lot of overlap on those three projects, so the coordination is certainly happening.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I next see a comment or question rather from working group member Bill Carlson, who asks, why not use the bridges for pedestrians and bikes as opposed to the cars?
Yeah, and we can look further. I know this question has come up before about pedestrian bridges. We talked about it in an earlier meeting, and the getting people to go up, to go across, to go back down is always a challenge. Folks want to go the shortest distance, and if that's at grade going straight across an intersection, that's really typically where people would choose to go, unless there is a physical barrier that precludes it, or if topography lends itself to that crossing happening a little more fluidly without having quite so much ramp or stair climbing, if you will. We can look at that and kind of show how those would lay out in this project, and you certainly do have the accessibility requirements that result in longer ramps and such. But in my experience, if you build a ramp and you have an at-grade crossing side by side, the vast majority of people are going to take that at-grade crossing because it's shorter. If you build a ramp and a bridge and you don't have an at-grade, you still end up with people crossing at grade unless there's a physical barrier that precludes it. So it's always a tricky design element to put in those grade separated pedestrian crossings unless the topography lends itself to it or there's that physical barrier. But we'll look at that, and we'll have that for discussion at a future meeting.
Thank you for the question, Bill. We next have a comment in the Q&A from Ralph, who says there's definitely a need for shorter walk crossing paths for people with disabilities and seniors. So thank you for that comment, Ralph. We appreciate that. Are there any comments? Are there any final comments or questions for members of the working group or the public in attendance before we transition to some of the study's next steps? Brad?
Sorry, Michaela, thanks. Just wanted to respectfully request that as you get ready for the working group's next milestone a couple of months from now, that we make sure that we've future-proofed any of the work that the team is doing, knowing that we're going to have a much clearer understanding of the MBTA's proposed bus network a couple of months from now. I just really want to make sure that designs are not progressing in a way that we pass milestones that we can't go back to and evaluate. For example, it's not just the Silver Line, right? It's also thinking about the future of the Route 134 or some equivalent service. It's thinking about better connections between Assembly and Wellington and all of the great surrounding neighborhoods. So I'm just really looking forward to that and want to make sure we all keep focused on that interaction. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, seeing no additional hands raised or anything in the Q&A, we will now move to the next steps for the study. So next slide, please, Natalie. So as part of our next steps, we'll work to refine the alternatives based on today's discussion, and we'll begin to start looking at some of the future conditions as well, like Gary mentioned. And so during the alternatives analysis process, we'll have our 5th working group meeting, as well as our 2nd public information meeting to share those findings and gather input. So next slide, please. So we plan to hold that next working group meeting this winter and the 2nd public information meeting in the spring. And as I mentioned, these are some of this chart shows some of our next steps. So working through that analysis process for the alternatives. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, we plan to have that next working group meeting in the winter and the 2nd information meeting in the spring for the public. And so for additional information on the study, please visit our study website. And for members of the public in attendance today, I encourage you to sign up to receive study updates on our website if you haven't already. As I mentioned, the materials from this meeting, including the video recording, will be made available on that study website. And so with that, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.